Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Africa podcast. I'm your host, Andy. Last episode, we dove into the reign of one of Imerina's most revered monarchs in its history, the wise and measured mpanjaka, Andriamasinavalona. Despite his generally positive reputation as a ruler, though, Andriamasinavalona is strangely also well known for making one of the most disastrous decisions in the history of Imerina. This decision sparked 7 decades of destruction and misery, and ruined thousands of lives. All of this begs the question, how did such an otherwise intelligent and forward-thinking man make such a disastrous choice? And was there any warning for what could go wrong? Season 4, Episode 11, The Crisis of the 18th Century, Part 1, Andriamasinavalona's Blunder. History is rife with stories of people who refuse to relinquish power, no matter the cost or damage of such a decision. On the other hand, it is relatively uncommon to see the opposite. People who intentionally abdicate their own power and authority, despite external pressure to do otherwise. By the year 1705, Imerina had enjoyed decades of prosperous rule under the watchful rule of Andriamasinavalona. Depending on which estimate you believe, his rule had started either in 1667 or 1675, meaning that, as our story begins, Andriamasinavalona had been king of Imerina for between 30 and 38 years. Now, by the nature of the medium of history podcasting, time can get quite condensed. For us, the majority of Andriamasinavalona's rule was a roughly 30-minute summary. But put yourself in the perspective of a Merina person in 1700. Where were you personally 30 years ago? Think about how long ago that truly feels. Maybe you were getting married, buying your first car, going to school for the first time, learning to read, or maybe not even born yet. Now imagine that for this entire 30-year period of your life, between now and that moment, that you had experienced life under the same prosperous government. To the elders of Imerina, life before the peaceful rule of Andriamasinavalona was like a distant memory, while to the younger people, there was no memory of the time before. It was all they ever knew. Fitting with his persona as a wise, forward-thinking statesman, Andriamasinavalona had dedicated a great deal of consideration to what he thought should happen after his death. Fortunately for Andriamasinavalona, he was of course not working from scratch when it came to the laws of succession. We've dedicated a great deal of time on the show talking about the so-called organized succession, its rules, evolutions, and whatnot. So Andriamasinavalona had to figure out a way to make his family fit into this pre-existing model. Now, you might remember from last episode that one of Andriamasinavalona's most well-known and successful policies was the diplomatic integration of surrounding polities and kingdoms into his own. While this policy was certainly effective at expanding the king's authority, it did have some interesting side effects. This is because many of these agreements of submission between Andriamasinavalona and the royalty of surrounding states was often sealed with a wedding between the mpanjaka Imerina and the sister or daughter of the king he was negotiating with. Now, by this point in history, polygamy had long since become an accepted practice among Merina royalty, but this usually took the form of a king having somewhere between 2 to maybe 3 or 4 wives. Andriamasinavalona, on the other hand, had 12, mostly coming from the aforementioned diplomatic agreements. Fortunately, the institutions of organized succession were more than prepared for this type of situation. Following the precedent of his forefathers, Andriamasinavalona arranged for his first wife, who herself was a royal descendant and his second cousin, to be the only bearer of legitimate children who could inherit the status of mpanjaka Imerina. His other children were categorized as yet another entry in the growing list of Andriana subcastes, who would go on to fulfill typical Andriana roles such as landowners, bureaucrats, and other key, powerful positions within the nobility. In fact, due to the king's recent policies of reorganizing and re-regulating the system of land ownership, it was possible for members of this newly christened subcaste to leverage their close relationship to the king to receive preferential treatment, with the line of Andriamasinavalona often receiving the most productive regions to govern over. As a result, this line of Andriana would gradually become the most influential we've seen so far. So, with the role of his numerous sons from his other marriages easily filed away, the question now came down to who would inherit the kingdom out of his 4 legitimate heirs. It was on the question of inheritance in which Andriamasinvalona would commit his greatest, most infamous folly. Which, honestly, is kind of understandable. Despite the fact that Imerina theoretically had a centuries-long tradition of organized succession in which the oldest eligible son would inherit the kingship, the question of which of the king's legitimate heirs would inherit the kingdom was so riddled with asterisks and exceptions, to the point where you could hardly even say that there was a firm precedent to follow. It didn't help that Andriamasinavalona himself was one of these exceptions. Remember, his older brother inherited the kingship before getting overthrown by a Hofa uprising, which instated the younger brother as king. With all this in mind, let's just say that there wasn't a universally adhered to precedent regarding which of his 4 eligible sons would inherit the kingdom. As a result, Andriamasinavalona was torn on which of his 4 eligible sons should inherit his mantle of king after his eventual departure. To assist him in judging the merit of his sons, Andriamasinavalona enlisted the support of his longtime ally and close advisor, the Maker of Days, Andriamampandry. The seer devised a series of tests to gauge each son's personality based on rumors that he had heard floating around. Andriamasinavallona's eldest son, the default choice to inherit the throne, and who had been granted governorship over the lands of the capital at Antananarivo, had a bit of a reputation for being greedy. So Andriamampandry visited the son and presented him with a gift, an enormous jar full of precious quality honey. Confirming the rumor, the eldest son immediately consumed the entire jar without sharing a single drop with friends or family, and eventually even smashed the jar open to get every last drop of remaining honey out of its tough-to-reach crevices. Based on the test, Andriamampandry concluded that if the eldest son was allowed to inherit the throne, that he would treat the kingdom like a honeypot, a well of treasure to be selfishly consumed and discarded. Next, he visited the Prince of Alessora, Andriamasinavalona's son with the greatest reputation for impulsiveness and ill temper. To test these rumors, Andriamampandry presented the prince with a gift of a beautiful Vasa parrot, a bird often kept as a prestige pet by the nobility of Madagascar. While the prince was grateful and polite while receiving the gift, he apparently misunderstood the bird's purpose, killing the parrot and eating it for dinner. The Prince of Alessora, Andriamampandry concluded, was, as he put it, a gun that loads itself, a man who was too much of a slave to his own impulses to be trusted with leadership. For the next son, the prince of a town named Ambohitra Trimo, the Maker of Days had heard rumors of his gluttony and ill manners. As a test, he gave the prince a liver of a cow. While many cultures consider liver to be a perfectly normal and acceptable dish, Highland Malagasy culture viewed liver as the worst of the worst part of the animal, the most unappealing and unpalatable piece of meat you could possibly receive. Regardless, the Prince of Ambohitra Trimo was overjoyed by the gift, immediately cooked it up and scarfed it all down, confirming that the prince had no discipline, standards, or control over his gluttonous desires. Dismayed by the results of his first 3 tests, Andriamampandry possessed low expectations when he traveled to meet the 4th and final prospective heir, the Prince of Ambohimanga. The prince governing Ambohimanga was a young man by the name of Andriamasinavalona. He had never heard much about this prince, and didn't really know what he was going to do when it came to testing him. The seer visited the hilltop home of the prince, carrying only an axe and a rope. Upon seeing the Maker of Days approaching his home, Andriamasinavalona was overjoyed and asked to borrow his tools. Andriamampandry, confused, lent the axe and rope to the son, who proceeded to use them to butcher a special cow that he had been saving up just for the perfect moment when a special guest arrived. He then precisely and carefully cleaned the animal and divided its fine cuts into 2 parts, one as a gift to his wife, and the other as a gift to Andriamampandry as a show of gratitude for lending him the tools. Impressed by the prince's selflessness and strong manners, Andriamampandry now knew which son he favored to next rule Imerina. But despite Andriamampandry's outspoken advice, Andriamasinavalona still struggled on the question of succession. And honestly, it's hard to blame him. It's important to keep in mind that while from our perspective as outside observers, this was merely a political question that he was stubbornly refusing to address, that to Andriamasinavalona, this matter was intensely personal. These were his sons, his flesh and blood. He loved all of them. So that emotional element must have given him a great deal of pause when making this decision. And ultimately, it was this reluctance rooted in the love for his sons that would lead him into his most disastrous decision. One day, Andriamasinavalona called for an assembly of his subjects at the Andohalo public square in the Rofa of Antananarivo, so he could announce his plans regarding succession. In a crowd of assembled bureaucrats, subject kings, and nobility, both Hofa and Andriana, nobody was sure of quite what to expect. But whatever they thought they would hear, Andriamasinavalona certainly subverted their expectations. In a twist that would make M. Night blush, the mpanjaka Imerina announced that of his 4 sons, his successor would be all of them. Each son would inherit a quarter of the Merina kingdom, one in the north, one in the south, one in the east, and the last in the west, with these fiefs more or less corresponding to the areas that they were already acting as governors of. Meanwhile, Andriamasinavalona himself would partially abdicate his position, choosing to limit his own jurisdiction exclusively to the Rofa, as well as to act as a mentor and mediator on behalf of his sons. Then, when he passed away, the sons would continue to govern their quarters of the kingdom respectively in his absence, each with the full authority of an independent monarch, but cooperating on behalf of their blood ties. Among these 4 kings, the one who ruled in Ambohimanga would be the foremost among them, but that would be the extent of his power, the foremost among equals. In a sense, Andriamasinavalona was declaring the end of the kingdom of Imerina. In its place, there would be a Merina confederation of 4, known as Imerina Efa Toko, named after the toko or 4 legs of a cooking pot. As Andriamasinavalona concluded his speech, the assembled crowd at Antananarivo sat in disbelief. Hearing that their king, the beloved man in whom they had entrusted the authority to protect them, was not only resigning his position, but also basically doing away with the Merina realm altogether, was about as disquieting as news could be. Now, we can't be sure of how every assembled aristocrat and nobleman felt, but we do know how one did. The king's longtime head diviner, Andriamampandry. Fittingly, for a man who could divine the future, Andriamampandry made the prediction that, rather than cooperating as the king hoped they would, that the true outcome of Imerina Efa Toko would be a future of violence and strife. If Imerina Efa Toko was allowed to become reality, then civil war would be an imminent threat, as the sons compete with each other for influence, power, and wealth. In the middle of the assembly, Andriamasinavalona, apparently not knowing of the extent of Andriamampandry's disapproval of his plan, called on the old seer to join him at the front of the assembled crowd. There, he would clearly endorse the plan, alleviating the concerns of his fellow bureaucrats. But what was supposed to be a moment of political legitimization for the plan soon became one of humiliation. As Andriamasinavalona called for his advisor to join him, Andriamampandry refused, manufacturing a weak excuse that he, wasn't dressed for the occasion. Yeah, sure, let's go with that. The king awkwardly insisted that the seer was dressed, just fine, but Andriamampandry refused to budge. In an effort to just get the seer on stage, Andriamasinavalona announced that he had a few really nice cloaks lying around and ordered a servant to go fetch one for the seer. When the cloak was delivered, Andriamampandry, now out of excuses, made a drastic decision. No longer able to obscure his disapproval, Andriamampandry hoisted the cloak into the air and poetically tore it into 4 pieces before tossing it into a pile of mud. With his allegory made clear, the old man then lifted the muddied cloak and proceeded to put it on anyways, stating that although the cloak was ripped and dirtied, there was still time to undo the damage. This message of hope, though, was not enough to convince the king to change course. Now, in the coming months, as Andriamasinavalona prepared to enact his plan, various oral traditions exist which describe the desperate and sometimes kind of morbidly funny attempts by Andriamampandry to convince his king that dividing the kingdom into 4 pieces was a terrible idea. The exact extent to which we should take these stories as real events, or as an exaggerated conflation of the seer's disapproval more generally, is, well, up for debate. Regardless, they're too interesting not to share. In one of these stories, a few days following the assembly ceremony, Andriamampandry approached King Andriamasinavalona and told him that he had something really cool to show him. The king followed his trusted advisor until they reached a chicken coop. In the coop there were 4 large, beautiful roosters. Then, with the king watching, Andriamampandry picked up a nearby hen and placed it into the center of the coop. Upon seeing the hen, all 4 of the roosters began brutally murdering each other to compete for its affection. As the chaotic violence unfolded, Andriamampandry looked at his king in the eye and I imagine said something like, "Huh, isn't that crazy? I wonder what this could possibly be an allegory for." Apparently, it was insufficiently persuasive. This year would again pull a similar stunt, this time with a group of 4 trained falcons, again unsuccessfully. In one final, desperate attempt to dissuade the king from enacting his plan, Andriamampandry allegedly pulled one ultimate, dangerous stunt. Now, this story is recorded in the Tantara, but I do want to add the caveat that I don't believe it for reasons that should be obvious, but, still needs to be included. So, one day, Andriamampandry allegedly found a bull in the middle of mating season, when the animals were at their most irritable and aggressive. He then tied up the bull and guided it to the Rofa Vantananarifu, on a day when a small crowd had gathered inside for a festival. He then took the already flustered bovine and shoved it into the crowded Rofa. The angry bull proceeded to go on a rampage, trampling and goring several fleeing bystanders to death, while a few nearby pregnant women, presumably some of the king's wives, were so frightened by the traumatic event that they miscarried. When Andriamasinavalona emerged from his palace to see what was going on, Andriamampandry immediately let the king know that he was the one who had released the bull in the courtyard, killing all those people. But if he thought that was bad, wait until he saw the carnage that would happen if he divided up his kingdom. Somehow, Andriamasinavalona, rather than, arresting Andriamampandry for murdering a bunch of people, instead was just like, "Dang, that really makes me think," and kinda slunk off. And yeah, while a lot of these stories feature Andriamampandry getting away with political stunts that would be unthinkable for anyone else, pointing to the unmatched reverence and respect that the king had for the man, the idea that he could just, murder several of the king's attendants and or potentially important political advisors, and maybe make his wife miscarry just to make a point, and then completely get away with it, well, it's a bit beyond my limit for what I consider plausible. Apart from the efforts of his maker of days, Andriamasinavallona's quest to sort out his succession was also briefly interrupted by the continuation of an emerging crisis. A few years prior, a series of incredibly severe droughts hit central Madagascar. The effect of these droughts was staved off for a while. After all, the well-engineered system of reservoirs and canals meant that even in a year without rain, the farmers of Imerina still had water for their rice fields. However, the year came and went, and as the next dry season arrived, water still refused to fall from the sky. Then, the same next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, rice crops began to go dry, and the agricultural productivity of Imerina's farms plummeted. This incredibly unlucky spree of drought led to the onset of what could have potentially become a catastrophic famine. With a crisis of food imminent, Andriamasinavalona was forced to spring into action, and easily demonstrated how, despite his objectionable plans to succession, that he was undeniably one of the most competent leaders the island had ever seen. Without missing a beat, Andriamasinavalona began planning on how to handle the famine relief and mitigate the deaths of his subjects as much as possible. The king's disaster relief plan included tapping into well-stocked royal food reserves, as well as touring the outskirts of his vassal kingdoms to gain a census over which areas of his realms were suffering more or less than others. What he discovered was, at first, quite disconcerting. It seemed like no matter where he traveled, that at best the communities of his kingdom were barely producing enough food to feed themselves, and at worst, in imminent need of assistance. As the king traveled further west, though, he finally started to receive promising results. This region had been less affected by the ongoing drought, and had actually received a small amount of rainfall, which, though still less than they had expected, did allow these communities to produce a humble agricultural surplus. And, like many times in his career, Andriamasinavallona's positive relationship with his Hofa subjects paid off. The lords of his peripheral subjects were more than willing to sell the king crops at a fair price, despite having more than enough leverage to ring up the desperate king at a gouged value. But to these Hofa lords, scamming the beloved king, who in many cases was literally considered a part of their family through marriage, was unthinkable. In fact, Andriamasinavallona's beloved status among his peripheral vassals was so great that many even insisted on delivering large quantities of food entirely gratis, at a price of 0. These accumulated food stocks were then redistributed to the most desperate struggling regions of Imerina, relieving the area from the brink of a deadly disaster. While undoubtedly many people perished in what ultimately amounted to a 7-year drought, the famine of the early 18th century today is remembered more for Andriamasinavalona's impressive leadership in relieving the suffering, rather than as a time of starvation. It's important to remember that, while the stories involving his succession can make him appear stubborn and, frankly, kinda dumb, Andriamasinavalona was unquestionably a very, very effective, intelligent, and capable leader. With famine delaying the king's abdication plans, he was given a period to reconsider his succession strategy. To help the conflicted king, Andriamasinavalona consulted the wisdom of one of his holy Sampie. The king visited the shrine of a Sampie named Matsatsu, and requested its advice on the matter of succession. The Sampie's keeper, after consulting with the holy object, claimed that the Sampie had delivered a verdict, that the lord of Alasora, the prince who had killed and eaten the parrot, was to be the next ruler of Imerina. Taken aback by the unexpected answer, and exhausted from his last several years of conflicted internal fighting over this question, something within Andriamasinavalona finally snapped. The king, ordinarily known for his reserved and kind demeanor, flew into an uncharacteristic rage. He ordered the Sampie's keeper be put to death, while the holy object itself was thrown to the bottom of a lake. Any future veneration of the object was similarly criminalized, and anyone who was caught singing its praises would meet the same deadly fate as its keeper. The king then turned to the keepers of 2 other Sampie, Kelimelasa and Sorata. As you might expect, the keepers wisely avoided the king's questions, with the former saying, just do what you want, man, and the latter claiming that the Sampie had, somehow ended up buried underground, and he'd get back to the king as soon as he found where it was. The stress of picking his successor was clearly beginning to wear on the king's mental state, putting him on the verge of a total breakdown. The advice of his allies and his own internal preferences told him that the prince of Ambohimanga, Andriamasinavalona, should be the next king. But his own paternal instincts and love refused to let him make such a designation. But with the contradiction within him becoming more apparent with every passing day, Andriamasinavalona finally made his decision. After years of desperate struggling, the king finally came to agree with Andriamampandry, and declared Andriamasinavalona as his heir apparent. While most of the Merina elite were relieved by the decision and applauded the king's change of heart, 3 people very much did not. Those were the 3 other sons, for whom power and sovereignty had been dangled right in front of their face, only to have it be suddenly ripped away. One of these sons, the gluttonous lord of Ambohidratrimo, concocted a plan to reverse his father's change in succession. He would kidnap the king. The son's plan was, kinda convoluted, but quite genius as well in its own strange way. The Prince of Ambohidratrimo first schemed to provoke a rebellion against himself. As part of this plan, the prince began making provocative demands, basically designed to irk the local Hofa as much as he could. One particularly inflammatory new law that the prince passed revolved around the locals' haircuts. You might remember that, as part of a reform to ensure good relations between the Hofa nobility and their Andriana overlords, Andriamasinavalona had passed a decree demanding that the Andriana must respect regional variations in culture and tradition. Ambohidratrimo was a good example of why this sort of thing was necessary. The people of the town were, at the time, known for growing out their hair long, and took great pride in styling it. In an obvious attempt to provoke discontent, the Prince of Ambohidratrimo began to order local Hofa to cut off their long hair in favor of an embarrassing new style. Both men and women had to shave their head to the point of baldness, and then wear a long toupee of braided hair that swung down to their legs. As you might expect, this really upset the Hofa of Ambohidratrimo, who, as the prince had expected, rose up in rebellion. The prince then dispatched a messenger to send to his father, telling him that the Hofa had rebelled and he was holed up in an underground cavern in his home. Please come help me. Andriamasinavalona, fooled by the plan, believed that his son had idiotically provoked rebellion by disobeying his commands. The king headed to the palace in Ambohidartrimo to reprimand his son, where he was greeted happily by the local people. Making his way to the underground floor of the palace, he stepped into the subterranean cavern under his prince's home. But just a few seconds later, the entryway was suddenly sealed behind him. The prince's trap had worked, and the king of Imerina was now his prisoner. The prince, having succeeded in his trap, quickly revoked his unusual haircut orders to regain his subjects' loyalty. Better yet, nobody other than the king and the prince of Ambohidartrimo themselves knew the truth of what was going on. When the king suddenly went missing, his son, the prince of Ambohidartrimo, assuaged people's fears by saying that the king was just staying at his place. Now, the very conspicuous timing of the king's disappearance was obviously more than a little suspicious. It probably didn't help his appearances that, when the other princes asked why their father had chosen to stay with him without letting anyone else know where he had gone, the prince of Ambohidartrimo's sole explanation was, I kid you not, I guess he just loves me more. Damn, that's just cold. Despite the suspicious nature of the king's disappearance, nobody really had any true grounds to question the official narrative that the prince of Ambohidartrimo was putting out. Throughout the king's imprisonment, the prince would routinely offer to free his father in exchange for endorsing him as the next mpanjaka Merina, an offer which Andriamasinavalona categorically refused. For years, this cycle continued, with the prince demanding that his father designate him as the next king, his father refusing to do so, and then the prince keeping him trapped in the basement. Meanwhile, the other princes and nobles of the realm had grown increasingly suspicious of what was going on over in Ambohidartrimo, but continued to lack the proof to take any action. But as more and more rumors began to circulate that their father was trapped in the Ambohidartrimo palace basement, suspicions only continued to grow. Now, the exact details of what happened next are very, very different depending on which version of events you believe. But somehow, after almost 7 years in his son's basement, Andriamasinavalona got out. The most popular version of the story alleges that the king's imprisonment was discovered by a group of local fishermen, who had been hired by the Prince of Ambohimanga to investigate the situation. When they confirmed that the king was, in fact, imprisoned, they decided to dig an El Chapo-style tunnel to break him out of his jail. Upon returning to Antananarivo, Andriamasinavalona gathered his other sons, captured and imprisoned the prince of Ambohidartrimo. In another retelling, Andriamasaka, being the loyal and capable son that he was, decided to investigate what was going on with his father himself, launching a military invasion of his brother's lands. After a short battle in which Andriamasaka emerged victorious, the prince of Ambohidartrimo, as disgraced Merina politicians always did, fled to the kingdom of Manabe to his east, where he begged the Sakalav king for assistance in taking over Imerina. The Sakalav, though initially interested in the offer, had actually been on pretty friendly terms with Andriamasinavalona, and were not happy when they caught wind of what had been happening to him these last several years. Instead of leading the prince back to Imerina at the head of a Sakalav army, they instead just let the prince huff about in his own rage for a while. In an attempt to lure his son back from his refuge in Manabe, Andriamasinavalona set up a remarkably simple trap. He simply started spreading the rumor that he had actually decided to change his mind and crown the treacherous prince as his successor despite all that had happened. Somehow, this worked, and the prince of Ambohidartrimo foolishly took the bait, and returned to Antananarivo. He was promptly called before a public hearing, stripped of all titles, humiliated, and then exiled again, just for safe measure. While the details of the retellings of the story vary quite considerably, the end result is the same. The king was free, and the prince who had kept him in prison was now a disgraced exile. With the king back in his rightful role, and a firm successor now designated, things were looking up. In 1710, shortly after reacquiring his freedom, King Andriamasinavalona passed away in his sleep, either from a sickness he acquired while in the cold cavern under his son's home, or from falling off his bed, depending on which version you believe. The last thing he ever requested from his remaining sons was that they cooperate and never seek violence against each other, an oath which they all accepted. So, Andriamasinavalona's long and twisting rule ended in a fittingly unusual manner. The story of his rule is seemingly pulled straight out of a Hollywood film, even featuring the plot structure of an inciting incident, followed by a series of escalating conflicts, a climactic confrontation, and eventually even a happy resolution. With Andriamasinavalona free to pass on his kingdom to his chosen heir, and his sons pledging to cooperate and rule as one unit, it seemed like both the external crisis of succession, as well as Andriamasinavalona's internal crisis between paternal and political responsibilities, were finally resolved. If this was a Hollywood film, the story would end here, concluding on this promising tone of hope for the future. But life is not a Hollywood movie, and despite the promising ending to their king's life, it turned out that the future for Imerina was about as far from bright as it could possibly be. The pledge between Andriamasinavalona's three sons will last for about as long as the day they made it, and Imerina will almost immediately plunge into the darkest period of its history. Join us on our next episode, as the kingdom of Imerina falls into a brutal period of civil war, and the country is, for the first time in its history, subjugated by a foreign enemy. Thank you for listening to the History of Africa podcast. If you like our show, then we would greatly appreciate if you could help support the show and our project of freely available online history education. You can do this by supporting us at patreon.com/historyofafrica, providing us a rating or review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or iTunes, or by sharing the podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy learning about African history. This episode is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon, including Naomi Kanakia, Ayofagbamie, Morgan Blackmore, Sarah Mpenza, Dimitri, Emmanuel Zaudi, Alexander Travis, BB Milliam, Conrad Schwenke, Travis Bell, Johnny Knowles, Godfrey Sebelabie, Evan Edwards, Pascal Nwakocha, Joe Maxwell, Nkechi Nwabodike, Sheun Olrontimain, Kwadwo Amankwa, Douglas Harder, Craig Bolton, Samuel Badu, Ghassan Firjiani, and Ni T, among others. Thank you all for supporting the show. It really, really, really means a lot.